Hi,
Hi,
Anna.
Reihan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, particularly because I have the great privilege of getting to talk to one of America's most fantastic economics bloggers. It's a rare privilege for me. So
It's funny because
thank you for joining
I
me.
was feeling privileged because I get to do the same thing. So perhaps should we introduce ourselves
Yes, I think
or
that
each
makes
other or
sense.
something?
You're Annie Lowrey.
Yeah, that's true. And you're Reihan Salam. You have 8 jobs. Nobody quite knows which is primary in your mind.
I,
but
I am
you
a
do
policy
most
advisor at
things.
Economics 21,
Yes.
and I'm a blogger for National Review.
Mhm.
And I'm little known fact that I'm not the president, but I am Minister of War for the Annie Lowrey fan club. You might be wondering, what does this entail? But Annie, please introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Annie Lowrey, and I'm unfortunately unaffiliated with the Annie Lowrey fan club.
It's a completely unofficial guerrilla operation.
Right. No, it's unofficial, and I'm the economics reporter for the Washington Independent. And so what we're talking about, we have a raison d'etre for this blogging heads beyond the normal raison d'etre for blogging heads, which is that you and I disagreed about some tax policy stuff.
Indeed, we disagreed.
Ago.
We disagreed very strongly.
Yeah,
but
we did.
Because our disagreement was actually so exciting and important, I think we should first talk about Larry Summers, because that is the news of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you and Larry Summers go way back. Larry Summers, in fact, little known fact that Annie Lowrey was the product of budding, and that Larry Summers actually one day he sneezed, and then Annie just kind of emerged from his schnoz. That's not actually true, but tell us about your feelings about Larry Summers and how he's performed as head of the NEC.
No, it's true. I was born from a postmodern novel in which Larry Summers, it could have come from a variety of authors, but anyway, yes, Larry Summers was stepped down as the head of the NEC. So one thing that I thought was interesting was, there was immediately a lot of sort of, people question, well, why did he do this? And it seems to me that it's fairly obvious that being the head of the NEC is kind of like a difficult and taxing job. And Harvard wanted him back, and now he'll go back there and they'll find a new head. And so, they said today that they're looking for a woman CEO, which I thought was like a kind of a hilariously offensive way to describe who you want to head your National Economic Council, a woman CEO. But they're looking at a number of very, very experienced candidates, among whom are some very good female CEOs who might end up with the position. So
Tell us about some of the female CEOs.
Well, it's the woman who was the head of Xerox until 2009, whose name is Anne Mulcahy. We actually don't know much about her, but people seem to really, really like her. It turns out this gives everybody the occasion to go back and look at what the NEC actually does, because I think it's relatively often confused with the Council of Economic Advisors. And the CEA, which is now headed by Austin Goolsbee, actually sort of like gives economic advice to the White House and, is kind of supposed to be independent advice for the president, but the NEC is kind of the actual job is sort of like a policy coordination job, and apparently people have said that this Larry Summers wasn't great at this because he's not much of a people person. So maybe somebody who is from the business community who has a little bit more experience, kind of wrangling people, would in fact be better.
I've heard many different things about that. That's interesting. I've heard a number of different things. One is that when you're talking about the NEC director, this is an incredibly important position in the White House. My friend and colleague Chris Papadopoulos described it as really second to the White House chief of staff in terms of influence, and which is interesting because this is, of course, a relatively new role created during the Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. And the first NEC head was Bob Rubin, who, of course, went on to become Treasury Secretary. And it's interesting because, my gut would tell me that you'd want someone who has a lot of experience in government, who knows how the intergovernmental process works, and who's very good at managing difficult personalities. And that could mean a CEO, as you suggest. It certainly doesn't seem like Larry Summers would be the ideal person. Certainly it matches his stature. And of course, Summers is someone who's quite brilliant and who understands the workings of government, but has never been accused of being excessively diplomatic, deferential, or polite. And it's interesting because, you also have Rahm Emanuel in that other, all-important role. So you have two people who are just incredibly difficult personalities who engender a lot of resentments, some say, amongst the folks that they work with. What do you make of that? I mean, do you feel like there's a lot of bad blood around Summers? There have certainly been plenty of rumors.
Sure, there have been plenty of rumors. I think that people who've left the administration have also indicated that it was somewhat problematic to work in the shop, that things didn't go as smoothly and people didn't feel like they were being heard, and that, the sort of the rumors that he bulldozed people were somewhat true. And I think it's interesting, these spots on the NEC. It's not a confirmed position. It doesn't go through the Senate confirmation process, which means that, of course, Obama could name Larry Summers without him getting dragged into the Senate, unlike a lot of other top economic gigs. So, like Treasury Secretary, for instance, obviously needs to be Senate confirmed, and the CEA folks are also Senate confirmed. And I wonder how much that had to do with things. That, Larry Summers probably wouldn't have survived a Senate confirmation hearing, although, he's obviously been in Washington for decades now and is very much a known entity, known quantity. But, so I think that from what I hear about the process initially, Obama thinks that Larry Summers is a really brilliant guy who had obviously advised him and as an academic economist is enormously well respected. And wanted him in the White House, and this was kind of a way to do that. And then he ended up in this role that he wasn't exactly suited for. That maybe you wanted him there as kind of like a floating sort of economic free safety to advise brilliantly on many things, but maybe not in this job where you're really coordinating a lot of people. So in that sense, the fact that maybe they would consider putting a CEO in there makes some sense. But I just don't think that there's been a ton of speculation, but no reporting. I don't think that people actually really know who they're considering. This was, I'm dead serious. This was, I think the better example of it was with Elizabeth Warren, where you had a ton of sort of like reporting where people would just cite people anonymously. And, of course, it turned out that virtually everybody was wrong. And instead they kind of made up this position for her. And she wasn't in fact confirmed. So, I don't have a ton to say about the Larry Summers thing. I think it's understandable that he would step down now. I think that this is a good chance for Obama to bring in some new blood after 2 pretty brutal years for the economy. I think that the next 2 years legislatively will probably be a bit less interesting, obviously, because they aren't going to have so many big bills to move forward. So this is probably a good time for folks to announce their exit. That said, 3 really, really big people in Peter Orszag and Christina Romer and Larry Summers are leaving. So I think that the White House's economic team could obviously look very different, or will look very different a couple months from now than it does from now.
Yeah, I remember when Goolsbee was being elevated, the CW for some was this idea that, well, this means that there isn't going to be a radical change in direction. But with Summers' departure, it certainly suggests that, there is going to be, at the very least, a change in tone, if nothing else. One thing I wonder about is, I haven't, and I don't think you have either, read Bob Woodward's new book about Obama's foreign policy, specifically vis-a-vis Afghanistan. But I do wonder, as someone who follows the White House economic policymaking team, very closely, some of the criticisms that arose in Woodward's account seem to relate to process and how effectively the president is able to manage the process of running the large federal bureaucracy, et cetera. Have you seen anything in the workings of the economic policymaking team that suggests to you that this is there's room for improvement here? Anything systematic you can think of, or do you think this is really the kind of thing we're not going to have any real insight into this until years from now?
Well, I think you have plenty of insight into what happened around the stimulus, where obviously there were people like Christina Romer who were essentially begging for a much bigger stimulus, and then it was more political folks like Rahm Emanuel who essentially pared it back. Do I think that shows that there's a systemic problem in the actual economic policy making? I don't. I also think that to a certain extent you've seen this kind of funny political moment in which the White House knows that even if it wants more stimulus, more ambitious programs, it's not going to get them because it can't move them through Congress. So folks like Phil Spoliero, who, and he's the White House's liaison to Congress and does a lot of that, sort of like Rahm Emanuel does.
And he's been rumored as a possible replacement for Emanuel as well.
Yeah, and he has this kind of like funny sort of like phantom, like I don't know that anybody's ever, he seems, you don't see him or hear about him very much, but he seems very important. So he became very, very obviously pretty crucial. Whereas the actual just sort of the plain kind of academic thinking about what do we do and what will our policies have, I haven't heard about problems in that side. I don't know if you've heard anything different.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I just have a grab bag of prejudices and gut instincts that lead me to believe certain things. But speaking of grab bags of prejudices and gut instincts, Todd Henderson, a law professor at the University of Chicago, recently wrote a blog post that he later took down, presumably because a lot of the commentary surrounding his blog post proved very personal, and apparently it also drew a lot of personal criticism to him. And I guess this is one of those dangers of being someone who wades into public discussion. But if I recall correctly, Professor Henderson was talking about the broader economic impact of tax increases on a group of people you might refer to as upper middle income households making more than $250,000 a year. And Professor Henderson was talking a lot about how he consumes the labor of a lot of other folks. For example, when you're talking about childcare, when you're talking about people who are looking after your lawn or to clean your home, etc. And this is something that's true for a lot of relatively affluent professionals living in big cities that have pretty dense labor markets, including a lot of immigrant workers. You interact with a lot of different people who help you out in a lot of different capacities. And I understand that his argument was that if I see my income decline through these tax changes, I might be less inclined to hire such people. And of course, this drew really strong reactions from Brad DeLong and from you, among many others. Tell me about your thoughts about Professor Henderson's remarks and kind of how you reacted to them.
Well, I felt bad for him because I don't think that he quite realized that, like, Paul Krugman was going to be, attacking him personally, and Jim Fallows and Brad DeLong and a lot of other people who are quite prominent in intelligentsia circles and in the economic blogosphere. So I feel bad for him for that. But that said, he did write a blog post enumerating his family's finances and complaining about this country's tax structure, and it all just struck me as a little bit ridiculous. Essentially, he is a law professor. His wife is a pediatric oncologist. They make somewhere north of $400,000 a year.
I've been told that number did not come from him, but rather was imputed to him. Although I think that's an
so he didn't actually say quite how much they were making, but it was somewhere north of $250,000 a year. But two serious salaries, I would say. Serious. Like you mentioned, maybe these aren't folks who it's fair to call rich, but certainly there's some leeway there. But what I thought was so weird about it was that he went through and enumerated his fixed costs. So his taxes, his mortgage payment, his payments on his car, his payments on his wife's education loan, child care, health care, and then a bunch of other fixed costs. And he said that, at the end of the month, he was only left with a couple $100 per month. And so therefore he felt poor, and he felt like if his taxes went up, then he would see those couple $100 disappear. And so Brad DeLong's point was that the issue that this guy actually despite the fact that he was really derided for it, but he demonstrated the fact that if you are a person like Henderson, who I think, again, I don't think it's very meaningful to label him rich, but sure, he's pretty rich. Yeah. But folks who are richer than him have gotten much, 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 much richer. Whereas he's kind of like at the far end, the kind of farthest shore of the middle class, whose incomes have maybe stagnated and they haven't sort of shared in the wealth. And so it makes sense that he would kind of feel to a certain extent like he was being left behind. That's not like, I had this kind of, what I took away from it was that he doesn't manage his own finances very well, and that if he reduced his fixed costs, like Susie Orman would tell him to, that he would feel a lot richer because he would have a lot more cash. And, nobody forced him to move into $1 million house and all this other, it seemed to me that the problem here was not the government's tax structure, but in fact, Henderson's spending habits. And it's uncomfortable to make that judgment about other people, and I feel sort of terrible saying it because, whom I to judge. But, of course, I have no idea. I have no idea what he needs to spend on and what he chooses to spend on, and I'm sure that it is true that he does help his local economy by hiring folks to help out with his house and his kids, and, obviously he's a consumer of goods and services. But, the other thing I would note is that this guy's taxes aren't going to go up very much, even if the Obama plan goes through, which it looks like it won't. This guy shouldn't see any tax tax increase significantly for the next couple of years. The sort of tax increase that would happen if his top marginal rate jumped from 36 to 39.6%, a couple $100 a year. It's not that much money. So.
I think this is very interesting. I mean, this is an area where we really are have very, very different views. One of my colleagues at Economics 21, Arpit Gupta, is writing a very interesting piece right now that's drawing on some new survey evidence from Joel Slemron, Matthew Shapiro, and Claudia Sahm. And this relates to the question of demand stimulus and how did the tax changes in the fiscal stimulus bill actually translate into new spending. And one of the things they found is that actually for the vast majority of households, actually there wasn't an increase in spending. As you might expect, a lot of people were repairing their balance sheets, a thing, but it certainly is in tension with the argument that if you're offering these transfers to folks in kind of lower income households, it will translate into spending. What they found, oddly enough, and this jives with a permanent income hypothesis, is that households that expected to not see their incomes drop in the next year, in the next couple of years, those are the households that actually did increase their spending. Now, I actually don't think that the case for maintaining the high income rate reductions is really a case about demand stimulus. I'm perfectly willing to accept that, it really is about long-run growth rather than demand stimulus. And that's one thing that's been frustrating about when you're looking at congressional Republicans making the arguments, that are centered around demand stimulus. But I did think that was interesting. And given that we don't have a ton of empirical evidence about how those tax credits, et cetera, actually translated into fiscal stimulus. But I think that to Henderson, I think that it actually is pretty important that some of your recommendations, for example, which I thought were totally sensible from the perspective of personal financial advice to someone who doesn't feel rich enough. But it's interesting because what you do is you pare back the outsourcing of some household labor, you mow your own lawn, etc. And it reminded me also of some work by the economists Christian Broda and John Romulus, if I recall correctly, when they were looking at the different inflation rates for different groups of people in the population. And there's a lot of controversy around this or how to interpret this data. Right. But certainly, they found that when you're talking about people in the bottom third of the economy, let's say, they're consuming a lot of low-cost manufactured goods, many of them imported. And so they've actually had a very restrained inflation rate. Whereas if you're looking at these kind of upper-income households, they've actually had a much higher inflation rate because they're consuming other people's services. And when you think about these broader sectoral shifts, broader changes in the economy, it does seem as though, the sector that is definitely not going away is the sector of personal services. And so I do think that idea that, it matters that he is hiring other people, et cetera, I think there's something to that. Your point that it's only a couple $100 at the margin, I actually think is also an important one when you're talking about the justice of these tax changes, the fairness, and how it's going to affect the real lives of dual earner households. On the other hand, I think that, I would, and this will come as no surprise to you, I would suggest that the federal government has a lot of room for belt tightening long before we ask households like the Henderson household to tighten their belts. If you look at the incredible wastefulness of the federal government's energy expenditures, I think it's a bona fide scandal. If you're looking at, for example, in ACA, if you're looking at some of the trims to the cost of Medicare over time, I believe that, you're seeing like 10-year savings along the lines of $400 billion. And again, there's some debate about whether or not, those will actually materialize. There were 3 economists at AEI who developed a proposal for competitive bidding that would yield $500 billion in savings over 10 years. And, there are many other domains where I actually think that, through, fairly straightforward common sense changes, you could yield huge savings. So, I understand that, it wouldn't be so bad, but I just think that it makes more sense to impose spending discipline. And like you, I agree that, the proportion of GDP that goes to taxes will probably have to increase just up from where it is now. Certainly now it's in a trough because of, the miserable economic performance. But I just think that is where the fundamental debate comes in, and it's a matter of, who should be tightening their belts. And, again, I don't want to say that, let's fire more federal employees, blah, blah, blah. I think that maybe we could fire some, and maybe in some other domains like financial regulation, we could hire more. I don't mean to be reflexive, but I think that just the way that the federal government spends money, it just doesn't seem to spend it terribly well in lots of domains outside of, say, Social Security, which really is just a program where we're sending checks to people, and there's very low administrative overhead, and you could say that it's actually a program that works very well to do its job.
Sure.
Do you see what I'm talking about? I mean, I think that that's where some of the pushback comes from.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, I think that we sort of agree about more than, you might, not you personally, but one might recognize it at first blush. If the Obama tax plan went through, I think that raising taxes on the top 2% of earners would result in like sort of $60 or $70 billion of additional revenue a year. So that's not. I actually think that, to a certain extent, I think that we should have a more progressive tax structure, and I think that that should happen, and I think that that should be a serious conversation. But whether that happens now or 2 years from now, we aren't talking about that much money. Additionally, I think that you're right that, the Hendersons, if folks like them had that money, the sort of Republican argument, I think you're right to dismiss it. The idea that if we, give these people more spending cash, they're going to spend it is, has been thoroughly disproven.
Oh, I actually don't necessarily reject that argument. I dismiss it just because I think the more powerful argument is from long run growth. I do think that there might be some, but
there might be some marginal effect. I think that that's true, but I agree with you that the conversation I think gets a little bit topsy turvy. And what's funny is I think that both you and I agree that in general you just like to see pretty profound changes to the tax structure, towards other forms of taxation,
like a progressive consumption tax or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely, or some sort of VAT. But that's not part of the conversation.
But you want a millionaire's tax bracket, and that's one area where we couldn't disagree more. I mean, this is one area where I think that if there were pistols involved, we both might actually be lying dead in a gutter or alleyway, something like that.
Terrible.
Because I think that's something. But tell me about why you feel so strongly about a millionaire's tax bracket. I interrupted you, and please finish your thought, but I just wanted to be sure we got to that.
Oh, no. Let's, I was headed there. Anyway, so I think that, the tax conversation that we're having right now implies that there aren't going to be big changes to the tax code in the way that either you or I might hope there would be. So we're just talking about income taxes. And I think that there's a pretty strong case to be made that income inequality has increased pretty dramatically over the course of the past 10 years and even a little bit before then. And the tax code hasn't changed to reflect that. I think that there could be some changes made to income taxes and to capital gains taxes that would essentially ensure that folks like Warren Buffett and basically millionaires were paying a higher share of the tax burden, which I actually think has fallen probably disproportionately among the folks who we might think of as sort of commonly rich, your kind of families with 2 doctors, and not enough on folks who are uncommonly rich, like hedge fund managers who sort of make $1 billion a year. So I argue that one good way to start moving towards that would be to create a kind of millionaires tax bracket. Now, Obama is talking about raising taxes on households making more than $250,000 a year and individuals making more than $200,000. I think that you could shift that number up and create sort of a more progressive tax system, and I think that would be good to do. But you disagree with me. Yeah,
I disagree for a few reasons. One thing that I'll say in your favor is that Robert Gordon of Northwestern has found that it appears that there was no increase in inequality after 1993 in the bottom 99% of the population, and that, as you suggest, it really is a matter of that top 1% having been spectacularly successful.
Right.
So that could be taken as one case for having some kind of millionaire's tax bracket. I guess my concern is that when
Sorry, just a question. Does Gordon's work because it seems like the Piketty and Saya stuff that's normally cited here implies that the shift has been highest among that kind of like tippy top of 1%, but has also increased for the 1% and the 5% and the 10%. So do you know if those two things are in conflict with each other? Or?
Well, they are, because Gordon is looking at a broader set of things, including when you're looking at consumption, et cetera. So I think that, there are lots of different ways to think about it. But I think that certainly there's a consensus that that's where you've seen the bulk of the increase. And Gordon is, kind of moving the ball forward by suggesting that that's where all of the increase has been. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I am troubled by when we talk about, this has been a back and forth that we've had and that many folks have had. But when you're talking about about the median household. There's a lot of concern about the composition of that household, how many individuals are in that household. Because obviously you have a very big increase in the number of single-person households, so that can create a somewhat misleading picture. And also, when you're looking at actual consumption inequality, the picture there is also very different from when you're looking at income inequality, and it seems significantly so. It suggests that there's a lot of underreporting of market income at the bottom of the population. And just as there's also, by the way, consumption smoothing, which is something that we ought to be concerned about. So I think that he's trying to draw together a lot of that information. But certainly, when you're looking at the tippy top, when you're looking at executives and managers at closely held firms, when you're looking at professionals in finance, that really is where you've seen a tremendous increase.
Sure.
And
so just to clarify, you're saying that if you look at consumption measures, well, if you're looking at consumption measures, you would expect the skew to be you would expect the skew to be smaller, right? So your average middle class family, because they would be spending a much higher proportion of what they were making, that would sort of skew you less. Or am I mischaracterizing?
No, I mean basically, Professor Gordon was trying to draw together a lot of different strands. He wasn't just looking at consumption, rather he was trying to tell a story about when you're looking at kind of the incomes of different people, kind of where have been the biggest gains. It's and he's suggesting that it's really concentrated. If you also look at kind of Steve Kaplan and Rao, they're kind of talking about sort of what's the actual composition there. But the basic argument is that since 1993, kind of that's where you've seen kind of the big increase in inequality, and at the bottom 99% you haven't seen this big an increase. The consumption stuff is only kind of a part of the story, but he's not just talking about consumption inequality.
Okay. Sorry, there's a guy who's cutting bushes if there's some background noise.
Oh, that's no problem.
So I guess that I just
So I think that sort of that strengthens your point to some degree, but where I would push back. Well, actually, you go ahead and make your point, and then I'll just kind of go back to some of the stuff about tax incidents and stuff that is kind of what influences my thinking about what the top marginal tax rate should be.
Yeah. So I think that we can talk about sort of fairness reasons. This might be very perfect, but I'll try and speak up. We can talk about there's sorts of fairness reasons about. Why the tax on the top, kind of 1% millionaires and even higher earners should change. I would note that it's incomplete to just talk about income taxes at some point, and perhaps capital gains taxes need to come in to the equation at some point. I don't. It seems to me to be both fair and economically prudent to raise taxes on that 1%, since they have sort of soaked up more and more of the nation's wealth, which is just the point that I would make. And that seems to me to be moving down, 5 years from now and 10 years from now, I think that we're going to still want that structure in place, because my understanding is that those folks will still be drawing in the sort of like larger proportion of wealth and income that they have been for the last 10 years or so. So go ahead.
My big concern is, are you really going to raise lots of revenue relative to the economic damage that you're causing? And I think that here there's a lot of disagreement, but I mean, I tend to think that when you look at like Austin Goolsby's research, his much cited research on executive compensation, I worry that it's only capturing the short run effects of increases in marginal tax rates rather than the long run effects. And I think that when you're looking at the longer run effects, what happens is that people change. You're socialized into working a certain way and working a certain number of hours, but then over a longer period of time, say over 10 years, you're going to encounter lots of different decision points. For example, when you get married, when you have children, that are going to relate to the amount of work effort that you're going to put in. And that also relates to kind of returns to scale. So how much are the people that you know, how much are they likely to work at any given time? And so that's one reason why when you look at the macro estimates of the losses from increases in marginal tax rates are so different from the micro estimates. And I think that it's one way to bridge that gap, because again, when you're looking at micro estimates that are just very short run, they're just not capturing the fact that, I just got a law degree, I'm, 30 years old, and I'm just going to be working this number of hours because that is what's expected, that's what everyone does, and, I'm not going to sort of, manage it based on like a little upward tick here or there. But, over a 10-year period, I mean, the whole culture's pattern of leisure and when you're talking about upper middle class people and how they behave and how they parent, that's the kind of thing that tends to change. approach. And that's the kind of thing that can be very costly. And so that's why I would favor the politically extremely toxic and not fun approach of doing something like increasing a flatter consumption tax. That is to say, in the narrow confines of thinking about what to do about the Bush tax cuts, I would say that I'd much rather extend the high income rate reductions and get rid of everything else.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not a position that is going to be very popular, but I actually think it makes a lot of sense if you, for example, let's say you got rid of the 10% rate and go back to a 15% rate, but you also increase the size of the child tax credit to some degree. I think that would be a much smarter, better targeted way when you're thinking about how to manage incentives, and also when you're thinking about some of the equity considerations that you're raising, while also balancing it against, revenue loss. Because, obviously when you're going from a 15 to a 10% rate, a lot of the benefits to that are going to these, very affluent people. But it doesn't actually affect their marginal incentives at all. Whereas when you're, kind of taxing their $250,003 or something like that, then it can actually have a pretty big effect.
Sure. I mean, although, here I disagree with you, because I think that you're actually right about the effects on, on upper income earners who obviously are paying a greater number of tax bands. My concern would be for folks who are only paying the 15% rate, obviously who get tax rebates pretty significantly, although it impacts their abilities to spend and budget if you raise that, that 10 to 15% rate higher. I actually think it's sort of an interesting question philosophically. So say that, as of tomorrow, I were queen for a day and we're changing tax rates, and, say that I said, all right, above $500 million, you get taxed at 70%. And over $1 billion, you get taxed at, 90% or something like that. The disincentive at that point would be enormous to making those kind of enormous sums of money, but I'm just not sure that it would be macroeconomically deleterious. Are you really going to reduce the incentive for those folks to work?
Wait, and you're talking about people at the top of the income scale?
Yeah, at the very, 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 very top. So we're talking about like massively unfair taxing here, right? So taking your guy who's making $1 billion and saying, for every dollar that you make above $1 billion, we're taking 90%, and for every dollar that you make above 500 million,
I just think
we're taxing 70% of it.
I think it's not going to affect their work incentives.
I think at that point you'll probably see them all move away, right? They would all move offshore and stop paying
I think it would definitely affect their work incentives, and I think that the other things that you would see is a much more aggressive use of both tax evasion and tax avoidance. Kind of evasion in the sense of kind of putting in an offshore account or emigrating to the Cayman Islands,
right,
or Singapore.
Because lo and behold, when you have $1 billion incentive to do things, you tend to do them.
Right. But
there must be some rates at which that doesn't happen, and again, I think that's skewing so that say that for every dollar over $1 billion you were making, you were paying 42% or 48%. That would raise billions of dollars over time for the government. I think that it would be a good thing to do. And, I don't know. I'm sure that there's plenty of research on the rates at which you end up sort of screwing yourself. But, I would be interested to see that. I should look at it.
Well, I see what you're, but I think the problem is that, it really is just kind of the ratio of how much economic damage are you creating to how much revenue are you generating. And I think that you're just creating so much.
I don't know how much economic damage you would actually create. I don't know how much you would be reducing people's incentive to work. It seems to me that also we're returning to rates that are historically perfectly normal. Obviously there was great growth for folks at the high end of the income scale and the low end of the income scale, in the middle of the income scale during the Clinton eras. Taxes were higher then as they were under Reagan, of course.
Well, we're not actually returning the Clinton era tax rates insofar as when you're looking at some of the new taxes embedded in the health law, et cetera, and also when you're looking at a different landscape in terms of state income taxes, the effective marginal tax rates have increased, above the levels that prevailed during the 1990s. But certainly it's a subtle difference. When you're talking about the pre-Reagan tax rates, or even when you're talking about the rates that prevailed after the 1981 tax cut, I think that one concern is that there was also a shift shift in income, and also there was a shift in compensation strategies. For example, it was very common, the mid-century United States, when you had these kind of incredibly high tax burdens for, a corporation to actually pay the taxes of top executives. Or, you would have company cars, and you would have all kinds of other in-kind compensation. And so I think that, kind of that was, one of the differences that you saw. You just saw a shift from in-kind compensation to cash compensation, and there are arguably benefits to that in terms of transparency, et cetera. But yeah, I think that, we have good, certainly the stuff is contested, but I think that we have good theoretical and empirical evidence to suggest that there would be a pretty big impact on work incentives. But of course, that's an area where we can agree to disagree. I just really think that that's how I think about it. And one disagreement that we had is a political economy disagreement. I suggested that the left should be wary of raising marginal tax rates to very high levels because it would actually, engender less, well, there are a few reasons, but it would actually engender a political backlash. But when you look at the history of social democracy in Sweden, there was this reluctant decision to rely on these flatter consumption taxes, precisely because that was seen as a better base of revenue that would be less economically damaging. But one of the happy side effects is that it also led to less resistance from, there was less of a kind of intense bourgeois reaction. When you look at the societies where you did have that kind of intense bourgeois reaction towards a kind of neoliberal revolution, Britain, France, Britain and the United States, they were very different from continental economies because they actually had much more progressive tax systems. So I think that even when you look at Sweden, actually, the top rate is something like 60%, but they're relying much less heavily on the income tax than on consumption taxes. So I just think that it would just be
It's an interesting point, and my hope is that at some point in the future we'll end up having this conversation about better ways to tax and including options like the VAT. Unfortunately, I feel like politically it's just not necessarily feasible in the American system. I think that it's possible that we will see probably fairly imminently some increases to income taxes, but it seems to me that there's just no political will for actually making the kind of broader tax changes that you've discussed because we don't have a parliamentary system and it's just much harder to do. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I definitely see your point, and I see the argument that, look, we're living in a second best world. We're not going to get these kind of ideal tax systems, so we may as well not worry about that kind of thing. But I would suggest that folks who are saying, let's really expand the size of our social insurance programs, and let's also raise a pretty small amount of revenue by really increasing taxes, not just on the Todd Hendersons of the world, but also millionaires. I just think that is a bad combination that is going to lead to rollback of some of these reforms. And so, in a way, I should actually be in favor. I should be spurring you on to do more of this because I think that it's not likely to create the kind of stable political configuration that will endure over time. I think that it's going to give more opportunity to people like me who are going to say, gee, I think we should actually really pare back these social expenditures. So that is just kind of my kind of cautionary note, but I think that what you're saying is, thanks for the cautionary, Reihan. I will proceed to put in place my millionaire's tax bracket. But thanks. Which really could
it was funny because actually, after we started debating this, there's some really serious talk on the Hill about doing it.
Yeah. Annie Lowrey gets results, so I think
it's true. I am changing your tax brackets from this couch. Just for you, this Reihan tax bracket is going to, dramatically alter. But, I do think that there's probably political will for it where there isn't political will for it at $250,000 and $200,000 a year. I think that that's going to be a pretty significant fight. And I think that the broader political point that you're talking about is interesting. Although then it's, people don't want to see their entitlements reformed, right? People are willing to see cuts to things like Medicaid, but they aren't really willing to see cuts to Social Security. That's a whole other massive, terrible problem. But I think that it's just it'd be better to have more comprehensive reforms of the things that we're talking about. But lacking a parliamentary system, it's just harder to foresee them.
I guess I'm more optimistic about the prospects for this kind of sweeping reform, and that's one reason why I was somewhat more sympathetic. Like a lot of people, including Meghan McArdle, I favor just letting all of the Bush tax cuts expire so that we can take a clean slate. And, my preference would probably be to have, federal taxes be a pretty small proportion of GDP.
Sure.
I would actually be comfortable with it being somewhere south of 20%. We might disagree there, but I think that, kind of that certainly makes sense to me. Just kind of let it go and let's start over again. I also am okay with the Boehner idea of extending them for 2 years or 3 years,
right,
so that we can,
which seems most likely at this point.
Yeah, and then we could just debate the issue again. I think that 3 years makes more sense than 2 years, and also, because the economy is so depressed right now, the revenue loss isn't as big as a 10-year revenue loss. My understanding is that the 1-year revenue loss from the high income rate reductions is something like $30 billion, whereas the 10-year cost is something like $700 billion, operating on the assumption that, kind of those incomes will recover as the economy recovers. So yeah, I mean, a kind of 3-year extension, and then, kind of talking about something like a progressive consumption tax. But I mean, I guess the reason why this debate is so interesting to me is that when you're debating that progressive consumption tax itself, there is this real question of what are you going to do with those, marginal tax rates? And I just go right back to the position, and it's a position that I think that, and I'm sure that he wouldn't want to count me as a fellow traveler, but, Matt Iglesias writing in the American Prospect last summer, talking about how, look, to finance these expenditures, I think that the real issue is going to be middle-class tax increases. You're going to want the people who are consuming public services to bear somewhat more of the burden of paying for public services, as is the case in Northern Europe. And I think that this really cuts against the instincts of, folks in the Anglo-Saxon countries. But I think that, kind of when you're going to have this very big government, I mean, I think that's, and you've expressed your sympathy for a VAT. I am less of a VAT fan than you are, but certainly a progressive consumption tax is effectively something very similar. It's just, the way that it's structured is a little different.
Right.
So, I just think that that's a really core debate.
When the recession is less of an issue, when unemployment falls below certain thresholds, a couple of years from now, I think that the talk will shift to, I think that you're right that at some point taxes on the middle class are going to go up. Hopefully that's going to happen a couple of years from now when employment has sort of stabilized, because obviously there's, for many years now, there's going to be pretty serious taxes on social safety net programs and on UI that will be quite expensive. And then, but that's even a drop in the bucket compared to sort of like larger entitlement programs. So I actually agree with you. I just think that we're probably not there yet.
I also think that you are working on your career as a kind of a highly effective political demagogue who will, in fact, become queen, at least for a day, through some sort of a military coup, possibly, or other demagogic appeals. And
right.
I fear for the future. And
I mean,
I just hope that you don't execute me
I'm going to have to take your... I understand that you're a minister of war for some sort of fan club. I think I had heard that at some point, so I might be calling on your military prowess.
Well, fortunately, I've been working on my military strategy for the Lowrey as it's called,
yes.
Namely a coordinated military attack on key installations of the U.S. federal government
Sure.
for years now. No, I'm going to be executed for high treason. So, Annie, tell me, you're also working on a lot of different economic issues, including the impact of cuts to mental health programs. This is a domain that I'm not super familiar with, but tell me, except, insofar as I'm moderately kooky, but tell me about this.
So, I've just started writing about this because it seemed like a little bit undercovered, but essentially a lot of states and very specific states are cutting their mental health budgets, and so it's looking at the impact of that. There's been a bunch of legal changes since healthcare came through about, insurers have to provide mental health services in the same way that they provide, general health services, but this isn't about that. This is actually just about budget cuts and the impact of these budget cuts. That's what I'm working on. But what are you currently writing about? What are you working on?
Oh, jeepers. I'm really just always working on the same set of issues, just sort of like long-term tax and budget stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of in terms of the next couple of days, I was going to write something about our friend, Senator Jim DeMint, and just talking about, his
super fascinating guy.
Aspirations for higher office. Yeah, and someone who I imagine you know more about than I do.
Well, I have my favorite Jim DeMint fact is that in high school he was he grew up in South Carolina, some time ago, and he was in a multiracial band called Salt and Pepper That's my favorite Jim
Well,
DeMint fact.
another little-known Jim DeMint fact is that the reason why he started wearing an asymmetrical hairstyle, as a member of Salt and Pepper, the group that Salt and Pepper later evolved into, is because he actually damaged his hair with a curling. None of this is true, actually. I was just thinking that would be very funny if, before his long and successful career in politics, he was part of a R&B sensation of the early 1990s.
They were a great group. They were better when Jim DeMint was in it. That was really the only time that they had real indie cred, I didn't listen to them later. The earlier stuff was better.
Just as sort of a question for you about what do you think about, the Democrats' political prospects? Do you think that they have made some sort of... Do you think that there's any economic message they could put out that would, help them contain the damage that's likely to come during the midterm elections? Is there something that you're frustrated, kind of to not hear them say?
No, I think that they were going to be pretty screwed one way or another just because the economy is so bad. It's unfortunate, I think, to see some of them running away from programs that were successful. I obviously think that healthcare reform was highly successful. I think that TARP was pretty unequivocally successful. And to see them not run on some of their victories, because the victories, for whatever reason, are unpopular, is a little bit difficult to watch. I wonder if you didn't actually sort of sit down as a politician and try and explain what TARP was, whether you couldn't, sort of move those numbers around, but presumably they've thought about it. But no, I think that they're going to get totally creamed. It's going to be, I think that it wouldn't be surprising to see a Republican-led House. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that all makes sense to me. I just have always thought the Democrats have, kind of a lot of potentially very effective populist appeals that they don't use as well as they ought to for all kinds of complicated reasons, including the class composition of the people who are elite Democratic policymakers. So I think that makes sense to me. I wanted to ask you a question, and you might feel like this question is unfair, and I don't mean it to, but it's a very sincere question going back to talking about the top 1% or the top 0.1%. I think that it's totally fine for people in that group to make huge, huge, huge sums of money. And I do think that there's spillover benefits. Some would call this a belief in trickle-down economics, and I think that's a fair characterization. And I understand the desire to kind of want enough tax revenue to fund programs that are helping people in, say, the bottom 10% to have better, flourishing lives. And, I think that there's an honest disagreement about what's the most effective way to raise those revenues. But I am curious as to what you think just about kind of outsized fortunes in the kind of the very tippy top of the income distribution. Do you think that do you buy the Robert Frank argument that there are consumption cascades that are damaging? Do you feel like it's kind of in itself a kind of bad thing that, you have lots of people making lots of money? Or I would like you to elaborate on some of your moral intuitions around these things that I think do play into both of our views about tax policy.
Yeah, so I think I would say that I don't think that making a fortune is necessarily a bad thing whatsoever. For instance, I think that Oprah deserves every penny that she's ever made. But I do think that we're only sort of just starting to understand the conveyor belt that took sums of money from middle-income families and let them accrue to basically a lot of folks who made a lot of bets in the financial sector. There, I do think that there is some sort of moral reckoning, some sort of sense that the sums of money that were being created were really extraordinary, and a lot of that had to do with broader economic financialization that I don't think we totally understand, and I think is highly problematic. I think that you can say that, certainly it's clearest with the housing bubble, right? A lot of people stupidly bought loans that they couldn't afford to buy houses that they couldn't afford. But, that money did at some point sort of trickle up, right? It ended up accruing with a bunch of hedge fund guys and a bunch of sort of investment banking guys. And so I don't think that I understand that yet, but I do think that there's something moral there that kind of went awry somewhere. So yeah, no, I don't think that making a fortune in and of itself is a terrible thing at all. I think that it's something that you should absolutely be able to do in America. But I do think that it's important that the way in which people get really rich is economically productive for everyone. And I worry that for a really long time in the aughts, it just wasn't. And so that's kind of how I feel about it. But I would say that it's it's more that I think that there's a lot of intellectually dissonant things going on there, and so it's hard to make kind of like a gray case. But in general, I think that a lot of the money that kind of like pooled in the financial sector was troubling, because I'm not sure that it was really productive for everybody. And I think that when you saw financial corporate profits kind of hit 40% of American corporate profits, I understand that financial services are services that are a service that the United States exports and is actually really good for the United States because, it's American bankers who are doing a lot of foreign deals and that, that kind of keeps the whole economy moving. So I'm not so naive as to say that everybody on Wall Street should find a new career sort of like hand-making shoes and selling them to people in artisanal coffee shops. But something went wrong.
Naive is the last word I'd use to describe you. Cunning and ruthless. Those are near the top of the list, but naive is definitely like 807th.
Yeah.
I definitely see what you mean, and Amar Bidet has written a wonderful new book about what he calls the case for judgment. It's a critique of robotic finance, and I think that he has made a lot of arguments that I think would resonate with you. So I definitely think that kind of thinking about capital and leverage requirements, thinking about how to regulate the financial sector, I think that those are good, legitimate questions. And yet I also think that when you think about that 0.1%, when I think, and this goes just back to our intuitions, because again, these political economy stories, they're very, very, kind of hard to really adjudicate among the different ones. I guess, when I think about the hedge funders, who are a pretty big component of that, kind of tippy top, I just think of them as having generally done things that aren't so bad, in terms of kind of improving the stability of the financial system. And, with regard
and notably, they didn't have a lot to do with the financial collapse at all. They helped hasten it, which was probably a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, also when I'm thinking about, kind of the, well, it's been a kind of boom and bust cycle, but since the, late 70s, early 1980s, if you look at leveraged buyouts, private equity, I think that now you're at a point where in terms of kind of ripe targets for private equity, there are just fewer of them because I think that a lot of folks in corporate America, a lot of those kind of manufacturing concerns that would have been ripe private equity targets in the early 1980s, they've just kind of learned to kind of optimize, debt equity and stuff like that. They've become more productive, and I think that they were part of the kind of largely unheralded revival in American manufacturing that we saw over the last couple of decades. So, I mean, when I think of the particular stories, my intuitions lead me in a different direction. I definitely think that there were people who profited. When you think about Carlos Slim, in Mexico, he's a classic example of an absolute crony. And do I think that there is crony capitalism in the United States? I think the answer is absolutely yes. But, my intuitions come from this belief that overall the bulk of these people are not, kind of Carlos Slims, but rather they're people who, in the course of, kind of amassing these fortunes have done things that are, generally creating, as you say, making the economy more productive for everyone. But that's, obviously, it's just interesting to me the way that basic intuition has such a big effect, because my kind of thought, see, when I say that, it sounds like I'm thinking, well, ergo they're great, and we should blah, blah, blah. But that's certainly not my, kind of core moral intuition. My core moral intuition is that I have no way of adjudicating. The Koch brothers versus Oprah. Like, you could say that Oprah has encouraged this, kind of really garish sentimentalization of American life that, kind of could make one really, what I mean? So I just kind of feel like...
The sort of like Thomas Kincaid, painter of lightism of our social fabric?
So, I kind of think that, I just kind of really, my gut instincts to bracket all those questions, and I always think of, the super rich as these people who are kind of really strange and have this strange set of impulses and, this desire to amass wealth that's kind of independent of happiness and other considerations of that kind. Mm. And yet this is something that we can marshal. This is something that we can kind of use for the kind of enrichment of everyone. You know what I mean? So, I just kind of think, from a public policy perspective of, kind of not so much, are these guys and gals, great, but rather, kind of and I think that's your broader meta thought too, what's the set of rules that works best for society as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's right. Wait, so one final question. In that sense, what do you think about estate taxes? What's going to happen to them?
What do I think will happen? I just kind of feel like it's going to be retained in some form. If you're thinking about what's going to happen over 10 years, I just think that there would be a lot of revenue loss, and I think that for, somehow we're going to kind of see them come back. But I guess maybe, I personally would like to see the estate tax abolished. just because, I prefer seeing that abolished and have a progressive consumption tax that just, kind of raises somewhat more revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it doesn't strike me as a very kind of good way to tax. And I imagine that kind of avoidance and evasion are going to be pretty expensive. If you wanted to kind of tax, kind of gifts as ordinary income or something like that, I guess I could be fine with something like that. But are you a big fan of the estate tax?
Oh yeah, I think it should come back and it should be massive. Basically, I don't think that you should be able to inherit too much wealth. And I'm all for setting the bar pretty high. I think if your parents want to give you, if your a family member dies and wants to give you like $1 million or a couple $1 million, that's fine. I think it's been weird seeing all these billionaires die and their estates go entirely untaxed. I think that it was just the unfortunate, the fifth billionaire death I think just happened. The fifth or sixth ancient billionaire just died. But yeah, I think their estate should be taxed.
I think also part of my intuition, and I don't, kind of want to weigh too heavily on this because I think that it would anger a lot of people from similar circumstances. But, a lot of my friends who are from the developing world absolutely share your political views and are really strong egalitarians as a result. And I think because there was something messed up in my brain, like I was conked in the head with some heavy object at some point, my takeaway from that is always like, gee, there's this birthright lottery, and anyone living in the United States is so spectacularly affluent by global and historical standards that I know this sounds crazy, but I just when I think about, someone who's has this kind of large fortune, and, inherits it and passes it along, like when I think of like Sofia Coppola, am I mad that Sofia Coppola is making these awesome movies instead of me? I just kind of think, I kind of like her movies. I mean, so when I think about this kind of nepotism stuff and intergenerational wealth transfer, I just think that, kind of having these pots of money go to people, some of whom are wastrels and don't use it very well, some of whom, like, kind of like the Ziff brothers, for example, kind of actually make this much, much larger fortune and do these tremendous things. I guess I'm not really bothered by it. So I go right back to that question of, is this a good way to raise revenue relative to alternative ways to raise revenue?
Mm-hmm.
Because, kind of, I just think that, like, my parents, had relatively modest incomes, and if they had way more money, I don't feel like I would be a happier person. And I think that they value their integrity and their autonomy rather than cash compensation.
Sure.
And I think that think that they were great. And I think that's why I just have never been impressed by people who amass tons of money, but I've also never felt... And I think that, this doesn't apply to you, and doesn't apply to kind of lots of people we know, but I think it applies to some people. So much of the politics of inequality is about, kind of status anxiety and this kind of resentment, and I just kind of feel like that's something that I detect, and maybe that also affects my intuitions about the politics of these things, and also what are the right policies.
Yeah. I think that's right. Also, it's 3, so I feel like we should go. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway.
Annie, thanks so much for chatting with me.
Yeah,
today.
Thank you so much.
We covered a lot of topics.
Yeah, we did, and what a good note to end on. Geez, because your parents are great. I can't argue with that. I have nothing to add. Okay, go off and enjoy your afternoon.
Okay, talk to you soon, Annie.